Wouldn't it be a scary thought if somehow he ends up getting free?
The most recent thing that I just heard just today was that the Iraqi leaders are saying that we're accelerating the timetable for taking over, and you guys can pull out here within the next year.
Yeah, that's right. They announced that today. They plan on us being gone by June of next year.
Yep.
We're still going to get hung. This is going to be hung on us, I know.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. But again, if it is God's purpose to bring about the end and to bring Babylon back to the fore, the ancient city of Babylon, raise it back up, and if the Antichrist is going to come out of the Muslim world and dominate the world, it may be that we're actually witnessing God setting the stage. How are we supposed to feel about this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we have to trust God in all this.
Well, and looking back through kind of the history of things too, you see a lot of the times when the nation comes back again, it's usually on the shoulders of of a stronger nation.
That's right.
When Israel comes back into power, it's on the shoulders of Babylon.
Yeah.
And I think, you see Babylon maybe coming back into power because of the same reasons of, those forces coming
right.
out.
Yeah. And God's, how are we supposed to react? Again, we need to trust God.
Yep.
We need to have a divine view of things, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to do that. Or you can do like others, find a cave up in the hills, stock it with supplies, buy your ammo and your guns.
I found somebody's cave once.
That wouldn't be a bad way.
That'd be very interesting.
I've thought of that many times. I mean, if you're going to go, it's better to go out
in a blaze of
in
glory.
a blaze of glory.
Amen. That's the Texan speaking there.
Well, I mean, to be marched up a scaffold, to me, I mean, I have dreams about this stuff.
Yeah.
It's if the theologians and the seminarians are struggling with these issues, how must it be for the average churchman?
Yeah.
I mean, he's just going to bolt and run. You're just going to drop your Bibles and you're going to go to the enemy.
Maybe, maybe not. Here's the interesting thing. I remember reading an article about what happened in Uganda when Idi Amin, isn't it Idi Amin? Yeah. Started wiping out the Christians. This is, and it's written by a guy who was a pastor of a church. And it's one of these things where, he comes home one day and everyone's been butchered. Idi Amin's guys came in and they would target people and they would just butcher them, torture them to death right there, and then leave them for everyone to see. And he thought, man, everyone's going to bolt and run. The next Sunday, standing room only in this church. The very opposite reaction. People fled to the Lord. And I think that what happened is, if this happens, you'll see the people who count the cost and say, I'm going to identify with Jesus. It's a purifying thing. But you will have those who do bail out. You will have a certain number who will bail out. But you'll be surprised at the number of people who will step up and say, I want to die for Jesus. A larger number than we would ever expect. I just hope that I'm one of them. And you never know till it happens.
Yeah.
To just be honest.
What you'll do.
Talk is cheap. You can say what you do. You don't know what you'll do until the day comes. And that's one thing like for my son that I pray for. Because I think he is going to face that day if I don't. I may not live long enough to face it, but I think he will. And I pray even now that he'll do the right thing, that he'll stand firm, and he'll die for Jesus if necessary. It's something we face. But anyhow, so he faces that. And chapter 9, of course, we come now to another section where we again have the promise of Messiah. And this is our Christmas chapter. And so here again, we're talking about, where is it? Verse 6. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there'll be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom. So in the context of this Syro-Ephraimite war, where Ahaz is bailing out and going for help, he's being promised Messiah. The nation is promised a deliverer, and they're to trust him. And in fact, chapters 11 and 12, this section ends with a talk about this future kingdom, the future restored kingdom, and the righteous king who God will provide, who will reign. Ahaz isn't it. And so they are to trust God, not Assyria. Now, what follows is then, what does he do next? He tries to make alliances with all the nations around. And Hezekiah is tempted to that. And so the next section, chapters 13 through 23, is the oracles against the nation, as it's called. And in these chapters, he goes through all the different nations that God is going to judge and who Judah shouldn't be making treaties with if they don't want to be judged along with them. Because who you identify yourself with, you get judged along with. And so, I love it because it begins with Babylon and ends with Babylon. But it includes the Assyrians. It goes against Moab, chapters 15 and 16. Damascus, which is Syria, chapters 17 and 18. Egypt, 19 and 20. Then, it's interesting, it's not real clear what 21 is. It's called the Negev. It may have been some tribal groups down in the Negev area. It may have been the Nabatean Arabs that were moving in at the time, or Edomites that were moving in at the time, or just southern Judah. The Negev represents southern Judah. And then there's this valley of vision, which interpreters take to be Jerusalem. And then there's Tyre at the end. So you've got all these different nations, including Judah. Now, this is written after Ephraim is gone, so they're not mentioned there. But even Judah is going to be destroyed. Now, chapters 24 to 27, which follows the oracles against the nations, is then an oracle about the day of the Lord. And I believe that it's looking forward to the Great Tribulation. These chapters are yet to be fulfilled. Now, 13 through 23 was fulfilled in history. They're already fulfilled chapters. Those nations have been wiped out. God fulfilled those. But 24 to 27 still looks forward to its fulfillment, to some extent. And 27 says that after this day of the Lord, there will be worldwide blessing. Healing, as it's called. God will heal the nations. But he will judge the whole world in this day of the Lord. Now, from this, the next chapters, beginning in chapter 28, you have a series of woes. Now, what does woe mean?
Beware.
Yeah, it means, doom is coming and there is no hope. Or it means, horse, stop. But in this case, woes as pronounced by the prophets was announcing unavoidable doom. That's the key concept behind woe. Generally, when woe is declared, it's basically saying there is no hope. There is no changing your direction. Everything is set. Your doom is upon you. So you have the woe against the drunkards of Ephraim and the scoffers of Jerusalem. Why? Because both are doomed to destruction. And Judah gets some more in chapter 29. And then there's even woes against the Judeans who flee to Egypt. Now remember, this woe is pronounced years before Jeremiah deals with that problem. This woe is pronounced against those people who are going to run away to Egypt in order to survive the Babylonian and Assyrian captivities. God didn't want Israel to ever go back to Egypt after they were delivered from Egypt in the Exodus. And if you went back, it was to judgment. And in fact, Egypt was judged both by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians. They're conquered by both. And who gets their head bashed in but the Jews who've run down there to get away from both conquerors. Now, in that context of this day of the Lord and all these woes being pronounced, again, notice chapter 32, we come right back to the promise of a righteous king, Messiah. Again, a pattern to notice in Isaiah, but also the other prophets, is there's condemnation, restoration. Judgment, blessing. It's always followed. Judgment is always followed with blessing. Condemnation is followed with restoration. Judgment of the world, judgment of the nation is followed repeatedly with the promise of Messiah. There's this kingdom coming. There's this purifying judgment coming from God, and it's going to be followed by the righteous reign of this righteous king who's going to bring in blessing. And this is, remember when this is delivered? It's delivered not in the context of Hezekiah's obedience, but it's in the context of Ahaz's rebellion. And so the promise is made. And this section ends, chapter 33, with the woe to the destroyer, where God says, now, by the way, the Assyrians who I'm using to do all this punishing, look at what I'm going to do to them. He's going to destroy them too. Now, this moves us then the section ends with comments about Edom. In fact, Isaiah gives as much attention to Edom's destruction as Obadiah does. And for much the same reasons. But we move from that to chapters 36 to 39. And in 36 to 39 now, we have this historical interlude, which is a hinge in which we have Hezekiah's faith and then sin. Now, it's a familiar story because we had it in the other books. But Hezekiah rebels against Assyria, which is the right thing to do in one sense. But God brings the Assyrians with Sennacherib to judge Judah. And the end result of this judgment is the only city left in Judah by the time they're done is Jerusalem. There's not another single city whose walls remain intact. There's not any villages that are occupied anymore. The Assyrians have stripped them all. And in fact, Judah is down to less than 50,000 people in their population. Israel no longer exists. They do have survivors. They've probably got 50,000 survivors in the northern tribes that are scattered all over the Median cities. Well, Judah's down below that. And this was after you had 2.5 million people entered into the Promised Land. We estimate 2.5 million based on the 600,000 plus fighting men. Well, now they're down to almost nothing because of all the different judgments of God. So, Jerusalem, of course, is besieged. Now, there are some people who argue, and I think there's some validity to this, that actually chapters 38 and 39 occurred prior to 36 and 37. They think it's flip-flop. I think they occurred at the same time. That Jerusalem's being besieged, Hezekiah, God tells Hezekiah you're going to die. And he's sick at this time. And Hezekiah, his prayer was really, now's not a good time for me to die. That's really what it is. And so God spares his life. But in the time that he's done this, and then God delivers him. He delivers not only Hezekiah from his illness, but he delivers the nation from attack. And they're delivered because Hezekiah trusted God. Now, we're told then the Babylonians sent a delegation to congratulate him on getting better. Means they had spies, most likely. Yeah, and he comes in and he makes a treaty with them. Now, why is his treaty with Babylon so sinful? Why is it such a horrible sin?
He's trusting in instead of God, he's trusting in this.
What has he just been through?
Appears to be a power.
Yeah. Well, worse than that, he's just been through the Syro-Ephraimite war. He's just watched his dad rebel against God and be condemned for it. He appears to learn the lesson, trusts God like he's supposed to. God delivers him, and then he turns around and makes a treaty and does the very opposite of what God has said to do. And I think that's why it's such a horrible sin. That's why it is as bad a sin as Moses striking the rock when he wasn't supposed to. And so he's told, you did. Your nation's going into captivity. it was, interesting enough, it was not, the last straw was not the idolatry. It wasn't the injustice. It wasn't the Sabbath breaking. The last straw was an alliance with Babylon by a righteous king who should have known better. Boom, and it's over. So that leads us to the second half of Isaiah, beginning in chapter 44, where then there's the announcement. Chapter 40, not 44. Where it begins the section with this announcement. I can get it to open to there. Comfort, yes, comfort my people, says your God. Hey, Handel's Messiah sings that song. And so we begin with this section with a promise of restoration and a call for restoration. And it begins by saying, Judah suffered enough. So a part of the reason for the return of Judah from Babylonian captivity is they will have paid the price for their sins. Now we learn from Jeremiah that was 70 years of captivity. That would fulfill it. And then in chapter 41, and later on in chapter 45, Cyrus is named. And again, here's an important aspect of that. The naming of Cyrus is in the context of God saying, I'm going to prove to you that I'm sovereign over history, and that I'm in charge of Israel's history, and that I control what happens in history. I'll tell you the name of the king that's going to send Judah back. His name is Cyrus. This is recorded about 150 years before the man is born. Okay? So that's very significant. And the point in this section, in several of these chapters, God brings it out. And that is that idols don't save. God does. God's different from the idols. The idols are stone, they're wood, and this is where he makes that joke about, a guy takes a tree, takes the trunk, cuts it in half. For one half, he carves out an idol, and he's got to put little pegs on it so it'll stand erect and not fall over. The other half, he splits into firewood and cooks a meal on it. He eats his meal, and he belches, and he bows before the other piece of wood, and bows before an abomination. And in this section, God says, you got these idols. They don't speak. They don't do this. They don't do that. Now, he makes fun of these idols, but remember, in their world, when they made an idol, they didn't think the idol was the God himself. They thought it was a representative of the God, and they prayed through it, much like the Catholics do through the statues and things like that. So they understood there's a God behind the idol. But in figurative language, God pokes fun at the idol. And why? Because there was no God behind it. They were deceived. But he says, in contrast to them, they can't deliver you, they can't provide for you, they can't answer you. I'm sovereign over history, and not only can I deliver you, but I can even tell you who will do it. And so that's the point of that. Now, Cyrus is called God's anointed, just like Messiah is. He is called God's servant. But in this context also, Judah is called the servant, Jacob. In chapter 45. I think it is. Yeah. It is Cyrus who will deliver servant Jacob. But also in this section, he talks about servant Messiah. For example, chapter 42. That the servant who is Messiah is named. So this servant motif again. Cyrus is a servant, the nation is a servant of God, and so is Messiah the servant of God. But repeatedly, the whole promise is that it is God who saves, not idols. And chapter 49, again, the servant of the Lord will redeem. Now remember, the Old Testament concept of redeem is the idea of deliverance, not salvation, justification. And so he's the one who's going to deliver the world and to deliver. And there's the promise in 50 that Messiah will suffer, but he'll also be helped by God. So the suffering Messiah, it's chapter 63 where we have the suffering Messiah that we always concentrate on. But actually the suffering Messiah is noted in several places. So he's alluded to. And then, of course, then when we get to 52 and 53, we have the clear suffering Messiah passage. But the suffering Messiah is given in the context of the previous chapters talking about the fact that God is going to redeem Judah. He's going to bring them back to the land. And again, remember, redemption, the Old Testament concept of redemption is not buying out of the marketplace of sin or the slave or slavery. Like in the New Testament, redemption, you could redeem a slave from the marketplace by paying a special price. In the Old Testament, you didn't redeem them by paying a price. You redeemed Israel by conquering their enemies. God redeemed Israel from Egypt by conquering Egypt. That's how they were redeemed. And so, here again, when he's talking about redeeming his people, he's talking about their captors being destroyed and them being sent back home. So it's an allusion to the ultimate destruction of Babylon. Is what he's really doing there. And so, now, one of the things to notice, too, is that in this context, Isaiah 52, we have the suffering Messiah prophecy. What are the different views on that? How do different people interpret Isaiah 52 and 53?
You have in the sin-bearing servant, you have Israel thinking it's the Messiah.
Yeah, that's right. There's the corporate view. That Israel says, we're the Messiah, we did the suffering.
We suffered, so obviously we get the benefits of the suffering.
Now, let's ask this question. In Jesus' day, that was their theology. They believed that even in Jesus' day that they had fulfilled this. And so therefore, the Messiah only needed to come conquer. They recognized there were two descriptions of Messiah, the suffering Messiah and the conquering Messiah. But they believed, even in Jesus' day, that they had fulfilled. Okay. How had they fulfilled it in their thinking? What suffering?
Dispersion.
Yeah, in the captivities, but there's some other.
They're suffering under Rome in Jesus' day.
Well, in Jesus' day it was under Rome, but
Was it the being conquered by the Greeks and all that?
I think they were looking at I think they were looking at like the Maccabean revolt time period and all that they suffered then.
Antiochus Epiphanes, the temple.
Yeah, the temple. Yeah. That's right. I think that's a part of what they identified, as well as just general persecution in the world. In fact, the Jews who still hold that corporate view now see the Holocaust as a part of that suffering. And in fact, they fulfill the suffering of Messiah by their good deeds. And again, by the persecutions that they still experience, they're fulfilling this. So there is that corporate view, yes. What's another view?
Well, it's Jesus, obviously.
Yeah, of course, we see the suffering Messiah to be Jesus. Yeah, those are the two major views on how to understand the suffering Messiah. Now, when we look at this prophecy, we can see how Jesus fulfilled it, right? Because it says, one thing it says he's ugly. So, Jesus must have been, huh? Well, not exactly ugly, but notice he says, behold my servant, beginning of verse 13, behold my servant shall deal prudently, he shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him. For what had not been told them, they shall see, and what they had not heard, they shall consider. Jesus was, I think this is where the Passion of Christ was much more helpful. Jesus was beaten beyond recognition.
Yeah, he didn't really do it justice, I don't think.
No, well, he couldn't. In fact, they asked about it, and they had to keep it within
acceptable parameters.
Yeah, certain parameters so that it wouldn't go beyond an R rating.
Well, that's why, I mean, Mel had that experience originally before he made this movie with Braveheart.
Yeah.
Because they had to edit out about almost 20 minutes of battle scene because it was too gory
Yeah.
to receive the R rating. And
Yeah.
and even in interviews about it too, he said he wanted to go a lot further with it, but because of that experience, he had to dumb it down to where it was within
And it was
acceptable.
still-
It was still bad. It was still
Rude.
got the point across, but not as, I mean,
Does it probably
as
occur?
it
Yeah.
occurred.
Yeah.
But
Jesus would have looked far worse.
oh yeah.
And I think one of the great scenes in there is after the whipping, where you have that top scene where you just see the blood everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you know, in all my life growing up, and you know, I envisioned him being cut and bleeding a little bit, but you can never imagine how brutally they beat him.
Well, in fact, you saw the soldiers too. They were covered in his blood as well.
Yeah.
You know, through it. It wasn't just a neat and tidy thing.
No. Yeah, and you know, and so Isaiah is describing that. You know, his vices being marred in many men, and you know that this suffering Messiah is going to just be brutalized. Again, fulfilled in Jesus. And then it says, you know, who has believed our report? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. This may even be an allusion back to the fact that he'll be the root of Jesse. But it talks about that, and it's, you know, he has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. And I believe the point there is that the Messiah that was going to come and who was going to be brutalized, like he just said, he's saying it's not someone that you'll be impressed with. It's not someone that you would notice. Not a handsome guy. And I believe that Jesus fulfilled that. You know, our closest description of Jesus comes from about 150 A.D. So we don't know how accurate it is. But suppose it's based on, you know, the witness of a witness or something like that. So it's relatively close in time, but it's still not an eyewitness of Jesus. But in that description, he's described as having red hair, of all things.
I knew it was the Irish. It was behind that.
It's the Irish, yeah.
I knew it.
And but that he was tall and strong, but that he was, you know, I forget the term they used, but that he was rather homely. You know, he was not a handsome guy, but that he was pleasant and apparently had a very pleasant laugh or something like that. You know, some reference to his laughter and pleasant and humor and all that kind of stuff. But you know, we're told here that basically what this means is, you know, he's an unimpressive guy. He's homely, and he fulfilled that. You know, he's despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. And you know, and that was Jesus as a carpenter, and as an unqualified to be a rabbi guy. He was despised. And when he's crucified, he's despised. So it fulfills that. And of course, then, he has borne our griefs, he has carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. So here's a key thing, is now, the author is saying this. Now, in their day, they would interpret that meaning, he suffers for the nation because of our sins. Which is true. Now, as we find out, though, he's actually suffering for not just the nation's sins, the world's sins. And the chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Now here, by his stripes we are healed is not healing in the atonement, as it is interpreted by some, but it goes back to the fact that our transgressions, our iniquities, need to be taken care of. And so the wounded and bruised, and stripes go together. Therefore, transgressions, iniquities, and healed go together. Okay, there's parallelism here. And then he goes on to say, you know, the classic line, all we like sheep have gone astray, we've each turned in his own way, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And the key thing here is in this suffering Messiah section, he's speaking in terms of moral judgment. Our transgressions, our iniquities. They're what's being paid for. And so then we're told, notice that he is the one who's paying for these. He is the atonement for these. Now it goes on. It says, you know, he was oppressed, he was afflicted, he opened not his mouth. He's led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth, which Jesus fulfilled in his trials. He did that. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of living. In other words, executed. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they met, you know, and so again, notice the moral language. The fact that he's dying for the sins of the people is a clear thing in this. And then, of course, we're told that they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he'd done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. And so, again, his being buried were Joseph of Arimathea. That's the fulfillment of it. It goes on to say, you know, it pleased the Lord to bruise him. It's put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he'll see a seed, and he'll prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. But notice, you make his soul an offering for sin. This is clearly sacrificial language. And it's important to see that, because again, this is why Israel can't fulfill it. Now, they think they do because they're suffering for their sins.
We could even go back to just verse 7, you know, there where it says, that he was led as lamb before the slaughter, as a sheep before its shearer is silent, he opened not his mouth. We see Israel complain constantly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they never shut up. Yeah, yeah. And so, and again, it's a singular person. It's a singular person.
Also, today they really are looking for a Mashiach. I mean,
that's right.
It's a single person today. It's amazing.
That's right. Yeah. And in fact,
a lot of groups of that we'd call them fanatic, long beard, and so forth. Right. The ones carrying the cornerstone up to the mound every year, you know, and they celebrate, and then they take it back down because they won't let them. Nobody will let them plant it. You know,
yeah. They want to build a temple.
They really are looking for a single person, which isn't that a change from Jesus' day when they were looking for?
Weren't they still looking for a single person though, even during Jesus' day? But
in Jesus' day they were. I'll say it's a change from 100 years ago.
100 years ago.
Yeah, it's a change from even 50 years ago. On a study trip in Israel, we got to meet with some government officials and other religious leaders who came and spoke to our group. And I was surprised at how many of them were looking for a Messiah. And when, of course, the question of, well, what about Jesus was raised? It's an interesting answer that was given. The guy said, the problem with Jesus is he didn't bring in world peace.
So I've heard the failed Messiah.
Right.
They consider him to be a Messiah, but not.
But he didn't make it because he didn't bring in world peace. He said if he were to come back and bring world peace, we believe in him.
Mm-hmm.
So he did not dismiss the possibility of a second coming of Jesus, but he basically said he's not Messiah until he fulfills the promise.
Mm-hmm.
And the promise that's going to follow here in the last part of Isaiah is world peace. That this servant is going to bring about this period of peace. And he said, Jesus didn't do it. Therefore, he's not Messiah. I mean, that's your logic. And you go, wow, you know, these guys aren't dummies. Now, the problem is, again, what? They didn't see the two comings because the prophets mix them together. And so they missed that. And just like here, you know, he'll see the labor of his soul, he'll be satisfied by his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many. I mean, wow. The salvific language here. For he'll bear their iniquities. He will die as their sacrifice. I mean, you can't get past the very clear, which we see fulfilled in Christ. But notice, it says, therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death. And he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So you see this role is interceding, the priestly role. You see that. But you see, dividing with the great, the conquering role. So that even the conquering Messiah is mixed in with the suffering Messiah, who is the sacrifice for people's sin, and the saving Messiah. So you have all the different things that Jesus did and will accomplish, all mixed in, even in the same sentences.
Can we almost see that too with the apostles too?
Yeah.
After Christ rose, they were expecting him to come back real soon.
That's right. They're expecting immediate bringing into the kingdom.
Right.
Well, it's time, Lord. Now can I be your prime minister?
Well, even after his death and resurrection, when they were speaking to him, when they were talking to the churches, it was, because the kingdom is at hand. It's like it's right there in front of us.
That's right.
Paul, would there be something to this that it took Paul a while to realize that he was to go to the Gentiles, as Peter went to the Gentiles, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, that the branch being broke off so that the branch of the Gentiles could be grafted in.
That was a later discovery.
It took them a while, all right, to discover that, and now the Jews today ought to be able to see the first coming for the Gentiles, basically, although we wouldn't say it that way.
Right.
We wouldn't exclude the Jews, but in a sense, historically, that's what happened.
Yeah.
And the second coming is for the final fulfillment of his people.
Yeah. And I think even the early church didn't understand it, and that's why God inspired Matthew to write the Gospel of Matthew, because one of the central points of the Gospel of Matthew is the delay of the kingdom. And the fact that not only is the kingdom to be delayed, but God has a program for the world in the meantime called Matthew chapter 13, the parables of the kingdom. It's not describing Messiah's kingdom, it's describing the work of God while you're waiting for Messiah's kingdom. And in fact, several of the parables in the Gospels that Jesus taught a delayed coming of the kingdom. The master of the house would be gone a long time, and his return was delayed. And what were the servants doing? And so there's this aspect of waiting for the kingdom, and it was something anticipated prior to the death of Jesus. And that's an important thing. Again, here you have, now here's the important thing. Clearly in this suffering Messiah section, God anticipates the death of Jesus on the cross. In fact, what did Peter say? That was a part of God's plan, foreordained plan. Right here it is. Now, it's in that context then that what follows is said. And what follows, especially in chapters 60 to 66, is the millennial kingdom, in which Judah, servant Jacob, participates and receives all the blessings. Now, why that is significant is what I want to bring out again. In God's plan, Israel was to reject Messiah, and he was to die for their sins and be the atoning sacrifice and pay the price for their transgressions. That's a part of God's plan. But in that same plan given here in Isaiah, that event is followed by national restoration, both physical and spiritual. So for the theologian, the replacement theologian who says that because Israel rejected Jesus, they're rejected by God and the church replaced Israel. Well, you got to deal with the fact that God, at the time that he says Israel will reject Messiah and crucify him and he's going to suffer, and he doesn't say crucify him, but they're going to reject him, he's going to die as a criminal, and in dying as a criminal he's going to atone for their sins. It's in that context, he says, and it's going to be followed by the restoration of the nation and establishment of Messiah's kingdom and the blessings that have all been promised. So, Jesus' rejection was not a surprise to God. It was a part of his program. But a part of that program is the restoration of Israel as a nation, as explained here in the latter part of Isaiah.
Doesn't that kind of go back to the fact that promised Abraham of, you will have forever, you will have this land, it will be yours forever.
That's right. It's yours forever. Occupying it is contingent on obedience, but possessing of it is a guarantee. And so here, you have like chapter 55. the invitation to participate in the millennial blessings. There's also the description of, you know, the lion will lie down with the lamb and not have lamb chops for dinner. But God calls on them to trust in Him. Now, chapter 59 is an interesting twist to it too, though. And I think in chapter 59 there's, in some sense, maybe even an allusion to what's going to happen in the day of the Lord, which is, He says, you know, now understand though, if the righteous who are going to be blessed and the wicked are going to be purged, are going to be judged. So you better get your act together. So even in the context of this promise of Messiah is going to suffer for your sins, and the nation's going to be restored, and you're invited to come join into this time of blessing, realize, I'm not going to put up with sin. Now, remember who He's addressing. He's addressing a nation that is someday going to go into captivity. And He's telling them it really matters how you live your life, because all these things are due to come. But who's going to participate in a restored nation? The righteous. So if you want to be a part of what's going to happen, live righteously.
You'll go through hell in a sense, but and you'll be deported, and you'll go here and there, and some of you may die, but
stick it out.
Yeah, stick it out.
Stick it out, and there's blessing on the other end.
Which is the same message to us.
It's the same message to us. Yeah.
Nothing's really changed.
No. We need to be faithful to the end. Faithful to the end. In fact, you know, the Old Testament, when we get there to Malachi, it basically ends with the statement of, you know, Messiah's coming. Between now and then, live for Him. You know, and just be faithful. Be faithful till He comes. And that's all they were supposed to be doing, was being faithful, waiting and watching for Messiah to come. And the few who recognized Him got the blessings of it. When, you know, as a baby He's brought into the temple, 2 people recognize Him. Of course, they tell all their friends who are looking for Him, who've been waiting. You know, I'm convinced that, you know, Simeon had this prophecy from God that he wasn't going to die till he saw Messiah. I have this hunch that Anna knew about it. Simeon probably told her, and she hung out so that when it happened, she'd be there. Because we're told that what does she do after she meets Jesus? She runs and tells all the other people who are looking for the consolation of Israel. She knows who's looking for Messiah, and she passes the word around because they're watching and waiting. Well, we're in the same boat. Revelation basically ends with that. I'm coming quickly. My reward is with me. Keep the words of these prophecies. And we have been given our marching orders, and that's what Jesus told them in Acts chapter 1. You know, it's not for you to know the times or seasons, but you got a job. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the rest of the world. Get the gospel out there. That's your job. Don't worry about when I'm coming. You've got to. And we're supposed to be busy about serving the Lord, looking for His coming, ready for Him to come, but we don't know when. But that day is coming. And so here in Isaiah, this latter part, he talks about that day that's coming. And then again, beginning in chapter 60, he talks about God will dwell among men, and the nations will come to worship. 60 to 66 is sort of like Ezekiel 40 to 48, where he describes the building of the millennial temple and the worship of the nations around, you know, of Jesus. This is a similar one. It doesn't go into the same kind of details, but it's the same time period. It's really describing the same thing. In chapter 61, he talks about how, again, the servant, who earlier had died for the sins of the world, this servant now is going to reestablish Israel in its land and in its cities, and they're going to be protected by God, and they're going to serve God as priests. Again, very parallel to 40 to 48 of Ezekiel. Why? Describing the same event, same time. Israel will be restored to the land, chapter 62. They'll be eternally restored. They won't be driven out of it again. So the return under Zerubbabel was not a fulfillment of this prophecy. In fact, One of the reasons why it was not, because it was only a partial return. We learn in places like Ezekiel and Zechariah and other places that when the return occurs, the return he's talking about here, all of Israel will be brought back to the land. None will be living outside the land. They'll all be returned to the land. All the surviving Israelites, that is. But, and one of the characteristics said here in this chapter, which is also true in Ezekiel, is that they will be a holy people. And in fact, their role will be to help the world worship God. So that's, again, motivation to live for the Lord. Now, interestingly enough, then he pauses in chapter 63 to remind them of their sin. And then Isaiah pauses to pray for mercy. And then we go back to the latter part now in 65, where he says, God's going to punish those who forsake him, but bless those who are faithful to him. Final reminder. And remember, the purpose of prophecy is to motivate us to live for the Lord, not to give us detailed information on the future. And so Isaiah has ended Isaiah with the promise of restoration, the promise of Messiah's kingdom. But he pauses at the very end to say, now remember, this means be faithful to the Lord, because if you're not, you'll be punished. It's a summarizing restatement. And then, of course, we have this very last section of the restored world. Some people take this to be the new heavens and the new earth, chapter 66. I don't think so. I think it is still the millennial world under Christ's rule. Again, this is where kids can play with vipers and the lion will sit down with the lamb. It would be a time of true peace. That's the whole point. When the Messiah finally comes, there will be universal peace. But not till he comes back. But again, the most important thing I see in this is the relationship. When you look at the flow of thought of these chapters, that you have restoration following the nation's rejection of their Messiah. So if God is truthful, and the only, you look at this, the only way Isaiah could have understood this, the only way that Hezekiah could have understood this, the only way that any Judean could have understood this, is that it would involve a physical restoration of the nation to the land with Messiah reigning over them. There's, you look at, there's no spiritualizing of this. He goes into the wrong kinds of details for that. So, God, as the divine author, speaking through Isaiah, the human author, I think you can say, hermeneutically, Isaiah intended his audience to understand this as a physical restoration of the land. Just as they were going to go through a physical captivity in Babylon, they would have a physical deliverance from Babylon using Cyrus, but that there would be this ultimate coming of Messiah who would then ultimately restore them to God and restore them to the land and bring about this universal blessing. And so you don't suddenly spiritualize that. And none of his audience would have understood other than a physical reign of Messiah on the earth. So that's why I believe that we need to see the second coming of Jesus as being a bodily return in which he will live in Jerusalem and rule over a kingdom, and that it will last eternally. Not just 1,000 years, but it actually goes on into eternity. But it's the 1,000 years, Revelation chapters, Revelation 20, 1 through 6. And so it'll be this literal 1,000 years, but it is this time that is promised to Israel, but it's promised with the understanding that Israel is going to reject Messiah. It's not a promise if Israel accepts Messiah. It's a promise knowing Israel will reject Messiah. And yet it will still be brought about.
somewhere it says that they will look upon him whom they have slain, or something. And
Zechariah 14.
Yeah,
That's right.
and so the prediction isn't it that they'll return to the land, but will Israel and Judah start living this life that they're called to live finally, and that usher in Christ, or will Christ come? I mean, is it more an idea that Christ will come and restore them somehow?
I think the way it's taught, like in Zechariah, Daniel, and others like Joel, is that Israel going through the day of the Lord will be equivalent to putting metal through a refiner's fire. They'll be refined like silver or gold, and the dross will be burned off. Zechariah tells us that is translated into 2/3 of the Jews will die. Will be purged. The wicked in Israel will be purged. They will die in this persecution, and all that will be left are the righteous, 1/3, who then, when Jesus returns, will believe in him. And thus all, like Paul says in Romans chapter 11, thus all Israel will be saved. Well, that's because the only ones left are the saved ones, the regenerate. Because God has purged all the wicked out of the nation. And so they will, so this day of the Lord, for the world is a time, like there in chapters 24 through 26 of Isaiah, for the world it's a time of universal punishment. For Israel, it's a time of universal purging. For both, it ends in universal blessing. Israel in the land, the Gentiles in their nations. And here at the end of Isaiah, it's the same thing. It's a universal blessing. The whole world will be blessed. The whole world will be rebuilt when Messiah comes. But it'll be at the core will be Israel. And it'll be the righteous remnant. And that's where I'm convinced in the Gospels, when people would come to Jesus and say, what must I do to be saved? What they were really asking is, what must I do to make it through the day of the Lord and enter into the kingdom? And that's why Jesus kept saying, keep the Mosaic law. Because you're not saved by works, except from the temporal judgment of God on the earth. You're not justified by works, but you are saved by works, in the sense of being rescued from judgment. And the same is true for you and I. We're saved by our works. And what I mean by that is, if you live a life of obedience to the Lord, then you won't fall into his discipline. Now, does it mean that life will always go well? Ask Job. It works out good in the end. But you can have some bad days there. In God's design. Any other questions? That's a good question. Any other questions on Isaiah?
It's just packed, isn't it?
It is. It is. We just are able to scratch the surface here.
This is too fast.
Yeah. I mean, you can do a whole course on Isaiah and still not get into everything. It's just fascinating. And again, the thing that gets me is it speaks to us. It's the same God. And we're waiting for this Messiah to come. And we're seeing the world. Right now, we're seeing the stage set. I mean, it gets spooky at times. Things, everything you can want is in place.
Yeah.
And you're just wondering, what's holding things up?
You just hang there and you think, how can Israel last another day?
Yeah.
Another day. And yet they keep on.
How can the rapture of the church be delayed any longer? Well, I think the answer there comes out of Peter, where it says that we can hasten the coming of the day of the Lord, by the way. We can change. I think Peter teaches that we can change the date of the rapture of the church. And I think the only thing holding up the rapture of the church is all the people who are elect to be members of the body of Christ haven't been saved yet. And if we'll get out there and share the gospel, and we'll get the rest of the elect saved, we can get out of here. And if we do it right, we can get out of here before April 15th. Save ourselves taxes. Or like I tell my students, if you pray hard enough and you get out there and share the gospel, maybe you won't have to take finals next week. Or 2 weeks from now. I had one class that they prayed for the cancellation of a final, and God answered their prayer. It was a Greek test, and it was a few years ago when we had this humongous ice storm, floods hit, and they had to, I think mine was the only final, and we were there, and in the classroom about to start the exam when the academic dean suddenly stuck her head in and said, I think you need to cancel this test because we've just gotten word that they're closing the bridges in 30 minutes because the river's coming up. And they go, answer prayer! So we look forward to that. We need to be praying, let your kingdom come. But the scary thing is now that I'm realizing, each time you pray that, it doesn't mean, like we used to think, that life would be going along all nice and normal and everybody's happy, and boom, the church gets raptured and then everything goes to pieces. It's beginning to look like maybe everything's going to go to pieces before the church gets raptured. And that means we face some very difficult days, which is what Isaiah was facing. Again, going back to Isaiah 8. And God said, trust me, stick it out. It's going to look bad, but I'm in charge.
In chapter 26, 2021, since he's talking about the day of the Lord and what we're talking about, could that be an allusion to the church?
No.
And the tribulation, maybe the rapture.
Well, let's see here. Come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourself, as it were, for a little moment until the indignation is past. For behold, the Lord comes out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth will also disclose her blood and will no more cover her slain. Now, I think this is a reference to what Jesus is talking about when he says, when the day of the Lord comes, and you see the abomination that makes desolate, in Matthew chapter 25, it says, now, those who are in Judea, flee to the mountains. Don't go back to grab your coat from the rooftop. Don't turn to pick anything up. Go and flee. Go into hiding. And if someone comes to you and says, Messiah's here, he's out in the field, or he's in this room, don't believe him, because when I come back, you'll see me like lightning. And I think this is the same thing, where he's saying, if you're going to survive the day of the Lord and be here when Messiah comes, then go to your chambers, shut yourself in, and go into hiding. Because that's the only way you're going to survive this time period of judgment. I think that's what he's saying. So it's not a reference to the raptured church. I think it's a reference to the Jews in the land and how they'll survive the day of the Lord.
Okay. Then back in 65, verse 17, it talks about it again in Revelation 21. I create a new heaven and a new earth. The former thing will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. Now, I've heard this argued both ways, that nothing in the past will be remembered, but then others argue only some things in the past will be remembered, and then others argue the things in the past will be remembered in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we teach that?
Well, the idea of shall not be remembered or come to mind, I think what he's talking about is the next generations, they won't even imagine what the world was like. In other words, it's not talking about God not remembering.
Right.
It's talking about the new earth, the new world order will completely replace the old one. There's not going to be vestiges of the old world around.
So in other words, when we go through the 1,000 years and then the new heaven and the new earth, we're not going to have a memory wipe.
No. We're not going to have a memory wipe, but there will be nothing from the old earth left in the new earth.
I almost get the impression that it's like, we have artwork from 200 or 300 years ago to go back and look at and say, hey, that was
it won't be there.
We'll be there, and that's about it.
Yeah. But we'll still have memory.
We'll have memory. But in fact, it's like this. Here's an example of it where we're told in we'll see this in Daniel's prophecies that you have the statue, and it's got the 4 kingdoms, and then the stone comes, and it hits the foot of the statue, which would be the chronological relationship, but all 4 kingdoms get turned to dust. And there's nothing left of them at all. Just the new kingdom. So when Jesus comes back, I think what that indicates is when Jesus comes back and sets up Messiah's kingdom, that there won't even be the vestiges of the Babylonian, Persian, Greek, or Roman empires. That all the remaining vestiges that still exist today. You've got the ancient city of Babylon there to look at. You've got Babylonian influences in New Age religion. You've got Assyrian and Persian influences in the world even to this day. Not just talking Persian rugs. You've got the Greek influence, Greek culture and Greek art and all this kind of stuff. Same thing, the Roman influence. Those things are still in the modern world. You can find the bits and pieces of them. Not in the archaeological digs, but in culture and in values and in the way things are done. When Jesus comes back, all that stuff is going to be eliminated.
Won't a lot of that be kind of taken care of with Antichrist here as well?
Yeah, Antichrist will destroy a lot of it.
The new world order coming together underneath
the
one headship of the one kingdom.
Yeah. But when Jesus comes back, there won't be... But see, even in that one kingdom, that new world order, there'll still be the vestiges of these. Right. But in Jesus' reign, there'll be nothing of them left. No memory in the sense that every aspect of Greek culture will be obliterated. It'll be removed. Every aspect of Roman culture will be removed. And you won't be able to find any of the ruins, you won't be able to find any of the idols, you won't be able to find any of the literature or artwork or anything. It'll be completely forgotten, in that sense, completely removed and replaced with biblical culture. And I think that's what he's talking about.
How do you, I know this is a theological question, but those that are raised in these cultures that never hear Christ, I know this is an old question, that are just totally the context in which they live is so different from the Christian context that they don't, yet God holds them accountable somehow.
Yeah. General revelation makes them accountable. Only special revelation can bring them to salvation. Yeah, they know enough about God to be held accountable.
So they're accountable and they're maybe justified in the way they live, as the passage in...
Well, they're not justified. I mean, none of them will become regenerate. If they don't hear the gospel, they'll never be regenerate.
But then there's Old Testament people who never will hear.
Right.
And then there's the African or whatever, the savage in Borneo who never will hear.
Yeah.
The actual name of Jesus, maybe.
Right.
Or at least there was a time there when they would.
Well, and there was a time when they didn't, but actually there's not hardly anybody left that hasn't heard. That's the thing. And if there is someone who never hears, they'll still go to hell. And the indications from Romans chapter 1 is, and this is how I would theorize it, is the reason they never heard is because they didn't want to. They were in rebellion, they were worshiping their own idols, and that was indication that they were not pursuing God. If they had really sought for God, He would have sent a missionary to them. But because they haven't, and he hasn't, it indicates that they didn't want to. And they will die in their ignorance, though they will still be accountable because there would be enough information in general revelation in nature that they would have known better. But they've chosen to ignore it.
Almost as a concept that there's just enough out there that it would drive a person to desire to seek the Creator.
That's right.
So if God draws them, they could be a child on an island somewhere, and there's nothing but headhunters for family members, and He would draw them out of that tribe, or send someone to them, or something would happen.
Yeah, something would happen that would bring them to faith, to truth. And I'll recount a story which may be an example of this. A friend of mine, I can't remember if it was a friend of mine wrote me a letter about this, that he met this guy, or it was in a Christian magazine that I read about it. This is a testimony of a guy living in eastern Turkey, in a Kurdish area, that there was no gospel witness at all. He heads down to Mecca to do his pilgrimage. Mm-hmm. They stop in a mosque to sleep overnight. That was the practice. The mosque provides sleeping things. And he's there asleep, and he wakes up and he has what he believed was a vision of Jesus. And Jesus comes and touches him on the forehead and says, you can't go to Mecca because you belong to me. And he wakes up and goes, what is this? And his friends wake up and they go, what's that glowing thing on your forehead? And of course the glow goes away, whatever, but he says, I can't go to Mecca. I'm a Christian. You know. So he turns around and goes home.
And they say, oh, well, we'll go with you.
Yeah, so he turns around and goes home, and he gets back home, and there's no Christian witness there. He's clueless as to what's going on. He's trying to figure out. He hears like on a radio station or something about some Christians in the city. So he goes to another city in Turkey to look for Christians, and he stumbles across the Jehovah's Witness Bible study. And he sits in on it, and he goes, "This isn't Christianity. This is just like Islam." So he continues to look until he finally meets Christians who explain the gospel to him, and he believes in Jesus and everything else. So if there is that kid on this isolated island, and they're one of the elect, and they reach out to God, God will get someone there. I mean, a plane will be flying over, and the missionary will fall out the window and land there. He will do something.
And on the same token, I read an article. A missionary had shown up in a village in Africa specifically, and one of